We have a picture of medieval women in our heads. It's usually a pretty bleak one. We think of a princess locked in a tower waiting for a man to save her, or we see a peasant woman covered in mud working endlessly for her husband and lord. We imagine her as property with no say in her life, sold into marriage for a piece of land. A person with no rights at all. And that picture isn't entirely wrong. For many women, life was incredibly hard. Their world was controlled by men, from their fathers to their husbands to the kings and priests who made the rules. Compared to a man of the same social class, a woman was almost always at a disadvantage. The system was built that way. Her primary purpose in the eyes of society was to marry, have children, and manage a household. Her choices were few, but that picture is also flat. It's a caricature. It misses the texture and the complexity of real life. To ask if medieval women had rights is to ask a complicated question. The answer isn't a simple yes or no. It's a yes, but, and that but is where things get interesting. A woman's rights depended entirely on who she was, where she lived, and what her situation was. The queen who ruled a country in her son's name had rights a peasant farmer's wife could never dream of. The widow who ran her deceased husband's workshop in London had more freedom than the married noblewoman whose every move was watched. A nun who was the head of a powerful abbey had a level of authority and education that was rare for any man. The word medieval itself covers 1,000 years of history, from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance. The life of a woman in 8th century France was vastly different from a woman in 15th century Italy. Laws changed, customs shifted. The world was not static, so the simple image of the powerless, downtrodden woman is just a starting point. It's the stereotype we need to look past. The reality was a messy, often contradictory world where women had to navigate a system that was not designed for them. They found ways to hold power, to own property, to make their voices heard, and to protect themselves. They had rights, but these rights were often conditional, fragile, and had to be fought for. They weren't given freely. To understand their world, we have to look at the different kinds of lives they led and the different rules they lived by. And we have to see them not as a single group called medieval women, but as individuals dealing with their own unique circumstances. To understand a woman's rights in the Middle Ages, you have to understand the two major powers that made the rules the church and the state. These two forces were everywhere, shaping every part of a person's life, from birth to death. And they both had a lot to say about women. Sometimes they agreed, and sometimes they didn't. First, there was the church. Its law, called canon law, was based on religious teachings. In the eyes of God, the church taught that men and women were spiritual equals. Both had souls that could be saved. This was a powerful idea. It meant a woman was not a soulless object, but a person in the most fundamental sense. The spiritual quality, however, didn't translate to social quality. On earth, the church saw society as a hierarchy. God was at the top, then came men, and then women. Following the story of Adam and Eve, women were often seen as weaker, more prone to sin, and in need of male guidance and protection. This belief shaped many of the rules. Yet, the church also handed women one of their most significant rights, the right to consent to marriage. According to canon law, a marriage was not valid unless both the man and the woman freely consented. A woman had to say "I do." In theory, this was huge. It meant she could not be legally forced into a marriage against her will. She had the right to say no. Now, in practice, the pressure from her family could be immense. A young girl standing in a church, with her father and a powerful suitor looking on, might not feel very free to choose. But the right existed. Women, and there are records of this, did use this to get out of unwanted marriages. They could go to a church court and argue they had not consented, or that they were already promised to another. It was a slim bit of power, but it was power nonetheless. Then there was the law of the state, which we often call secular or common law. This set of rules was more concerned with property, inheritance, and social order. Oh, and it was here that a woman's rights often shrank dramatically, especially when she got married. In many parts of Europe, especially England, the law operated under a concept called coverture. The term came from the idea that a woman was covered by her husband. Once she married, her legal identity was essentially absorbed into his. They became one person under the law, and that one person was the husband. This had massive consequences. Any land or money a woman brought into a marriage came under her husband's control. He could manage it, sell it, or use the income from it. She couldn't make a contract on her own. She couldn't sue someone in court on her own. Her husband had to do it with her. She was a femme, covert, a covered woman. Her legal existence was suspended for the duration of her marriage. But even here, there were protections. The system wasn't designed to leave her completely destitute. A key right was the dower. This was her claim to a portion of her husband's estate, usually 1/3, for her to live on after he died. This was her safety net. A husband could not sell off his land without her consent if it would compromise her dower rights. So, she had to be consulted on major financial decisions. Her signature might be required on a deed of sale. The opposite of a femme covert was a femme sole, or a woman alone. This was a single woman, either unmarried or a widow. As a femme sole, a woman had many of the same legal rights as a man. She could own property in her own name. She could run a business, she could make contracts, and she could sue and be sued in court. This is why widows were often some of the most powerful and independent women in the Middle Ages. They had raised their children, they knew how to run a household or a business, and they were legally free from a man's control. So a woman's legal standing was a strange mix. The church said she had a soul and must consent to her own marriage. The state said that once she married, her husband was her master, but the state also made sure she had a claim to support if he died. Her rights were not fixed. They changed dramatically the moment she said "I do," and they changed again if her husband died. She lived under two sets of rules, one for her soul and one for her property, and she had to navigate the contradictions between them every day. Life in the countryside was slow to change. It was based on tradition and farming. But in the growing towns and cities of the Middle Ages, a different world was emerging. This was a world of commerce, of trade, of craftspeople and merchants. And in this world, many women found opportunities and a degree of independence that was harder to come by in a rural manner. Towns were busy, crowded places, life was organized around work, people's identities were tied to their trade. You were a baker, a weaver, a carpenter, or a brewer. Guilds, which were like professional associations or unions, controlled much of this work. They set prices, controlled quality, and trained new workers. Officially, most guilds were male-dominated. But women were a vital part of the urban economy, working in dozens of different trades. One of the most common jobs for a townswoman was in making textiles. Spinning thread from wool or flax was almost exclusively women's work. It was low paid and could be done at home, but it was essential. Women were also heavily involved in weaving and finishing cloth. In some cities, women even formed their own guilds, like the silk weavers of Paris. This gave them collective power to negotiate and protect their work. Another major industry for women was brewing ale. Ale was a staple of the medieval diet for everyone, rich and poor. It was safer to drink than water. Much of this ale was brewed at home by women, known as alewives. They would brew for their families and sell the surplus. An alewife would put a broom or a decorated pole, called an ale stake, outside her door to show she had a fresh batch for sale. For many women, this was a way to earn their own money, independent of a husband. The business was so associated with women that when we see cartoon images of witches with pointy hats and brooms, some historians think this image originally derived from the alewife and her ale stake. The key to a woman's economic power in a town was her marital status. As a femme covert, a married woman, she worked alongside her husband in the family business. She was a partner in practice, even if he was the legal head of the business. She would run the shop, manage the accounts, and deal with customers. Her labor was essential to the family's success, but if her husband died, she could step into his shoes. As a widow, she became a femme sole. She had the legal right to take over his workshop, become a master of his guild, and continue his trade. Many guild rules made specific provisions for this. A baker's widow could continue to be the town's baker. A blacksmith's widow could hire journeymen to do the heavy work while she managed the business. This was a practical decision. The town needed its baker, and the woman knew the trade. It was a chance for a woman to be the boss, to make her own decisions, and to be a respected member of the business community. Of course, this independence wasn't guaranteed. She might be pressured to remarry quickly, in which case her new husband would take control of the business. Or the guild might try to limit her rights. But the opportunity was there. We find records of women running businesses of all kinds, from taverns and shops to trading enterprises. They bought and sold property, they lent money, they appeared in court to collect debts. Beyond the guilds, women worked in many other jobs. They were domestic servants, which was one of the most common forms of employment for young, unmarried women. They were laundresses, midwives, and sellers of food in the marketplace. The town offered a wider range of possibilities than the farm. It was a place where a woman's skill and business sense could allow her to earn a living, and in some cases, thrive. Life in the town was not easy. It was often dirty, unhealthy, and competitive, but it offered a different path. It showed that a woman's role was not just about having children and running a home. She could be a producer, a manager, and an active participant in the economic life of her community. In the bustling streets of medieval London, Paris, or Florence, women were not just wives and mothers. They were business people. The vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, perhaps 90%, were peasants. They lived and worked on the land. Their lives were tied to the seasons and the demands of farming. For a peasant woman, her world was the village, the fields, and her small home. At the other end of the social ladder was the noblewoman, the lady of the castle. Her world was one of politics, power, and high society. These two women might have lived just a few miles apart, but their lives and their rights were worlds apart. A peasant woman's life was one of relentless hard work. There was no clear division between her work and her husband's. They were a team, and the survival of their family depended on their shared labor. She worked in the fields alongside him during planting and harvest. She tended the vegetable garden, which provided much of the family's food. She looked after the chickens, the pigs, and the cow. Inside their small, dark hut, her work never ended. She prepared the food, which was usually a simple soup or porridge. She spun wool or flax to make thread for their clothes. She brewed ale, cared for the children, and fetched water from the village well. Her rights were not written down in any grand legal charter. They were based on the customs of the village and the manor. Her marriage was likely arranged with a boy from the same village. The decision would be a practical one, made by their parents. It was about combining two families' resources to work a piece of land. She had very little say in the matter. Once married, she was expected to be obedient to her husband. Local manorial courts, run by the lord of the manor, handled disputes. A woman could be fined for scolding her husband or for fighting with a neighbor. Her legal standing was low, yet her importance was immense. A man could not run a farm without a wife. Her economic contribution was not just helpful, it was essential. She was a partner in survival. While she lacked formal rights, her community understood her value. Within the village, an older woman, a widow, or a skilled midwife might be a person of great respect and informal authority. Her power wasn't legal, it was social, it was earned through experience, and her role in the community. The noblewoman's life was completely different. She did not labor in the fields. She lived in a castle or a large manor house, surrounded by servants. Her life was physically much easier, but it came with its own set of rigid constraints. Her primary purpose, from the moment she was born, was to be a piece in a political game. Her marriage was not about love, it was an alliance. It was a contract between two powerful families designed to secure land, wealth, and political advantage. She might be betrothed as a child to a man she had never met. Her value was measured in her dowry, the property and money she brought to the marriage, and in her fertility. Her most important duty was to produce a male heir to carry on her husband's family line. Failing to do so could be a disaster, potentially leading to the annulment of her marriage. She was expected to be a model of piety, grace, and obedience. Her life was public, and her reputation was everything. Yet, it would be a mistake to see her as just a powerless decoration. The lady of the manor had huge responsibility. Her husband, the lord, was often away from home for long periods. He might be at court, fighting in a war, or on a crusade. In his absence, she was in charge. She became the manager of a massive and complex enterprise. She was responsible for overseeing the estate's finances, managing the servants, and ensuring the castle was supplied with food and other necessities. She had to know about farming, livestock, and accounts. She might even be responsible for the defense of the castle if it came under attack. Records show noblewomen directing troops, negotiating with enemies, and holding their castles through long sieges. This was real, tangible power. She also presided over the household, which was the center of social and political life. She was a hostess to important guests, a dispenser of patronage, and a key figure in the local social network. While the law of coverture applied to her, a high-ranking noblewoman from a powerful family could not be easily pushed around. Her family would have a strong interest in her well-being. So we have two starkly different lives. The peasant woman, with few formal rights, but whose essential role as an economic partner gave her a practical, informal standing in her community. And the noblewoman who was a political pawn in marriage, but who could also wield immense administrative and even military power as the lady of the estate. For both, their rights and their power were not about abstract legal principles. They were about the practical realities of the world they lived in. The medieval world was a system built by men, for men. The laws, the church, and the social structures all put women in a subordinate position. But women were not just passive victims of the system, they were active agents in their own lives. They found ways to push back, to find power, and to make their voices heard, often in creative and unexpected ways. They used the limited tools they had to carve out space for themselves. One of the most direct ways a woman could assert her rights was through the courts. It's a common misconception that women had no access to the legal system. While a married woman femme covert had to be represented by her husband, a single woman or a widow femme soul could and did go to court on her own. Court records from the period are filled with women as plaintiffs and defendants. They sued people over debts, property disputes, and inheritance claims. They defended themselves against accusations. They brought cases of assault or rape, though getting a conviction was difficult. Using the court system showed they knew their rights and were willing to fight for them. Another powerful path for a woman was through religion. For some, the church was not a source of oppression but of opportunity. Choosing to become a nun and enter a convent was one of the few ways a woman could escape the traditional path of marriage and childbearing. It was a respectable alternative that offered a life of contemplation and study. Life in a convent was not for everyone, but for a woman from a wealthy family, it could be a path to power. The head of a convent, an abbess, could be a figure of immense authority. She managed large estates, controlled significant wealth, and had influence in local politics. She was a spiritual leader for her community of nuns and a powerful landlord to the tenants on the convent's lands. Some abbesses, like the famous 12th century German mystic Hildegard of Bingen, were among the leading intellectuals of their time. Hildegard wrote books on theology, medicine, and music. She corresponded with popes and emperors, and she was not afraid to challenge male authority. The convent was a world run by women, for women, and it offered a rare chance for female leadership and intellectual life. Some women found a voice through less conventional forms of religious expression. The late Middle Ages saw a rise in female mystics, women who claimed to have direct, personal visions of God. Women like Marjorie Kempe in England or Catherine of Siena in Italy gained fame and influence through their spiritual experiences. Their claims gave them a form of authority that did not depend on the official church hierarchy. They traveled, they preached, and they advised powerful men. Their holiness gave them a platform. Marjorie Kempe, a brewer's wife and mother of 14, dictated the first autobiography in the English language, a remarkable story of her life, her travels, and her spiritual journey. Women also participated in the great social and political movements of their day. They were part of peasant revolts, protesting unfair taxes and labor conditions. They were active in urban riots. They were also central to many heretical movements, religious groups that challenged the official teachings of the church. These movements often offered women more equal roles and greater spiritual authority than mainstream religion, which made them attractive to those who felt excluded. These were not easy paths. A woman who went to court could lose her case. An abbess had to constantly fight to protect her convent's lands and rights. A mystic could be celebrated as a saint or condemned as a heretic. But these examples show that medieval women were not silent. They were thinkers, leaders, business owners, and survivors. So, did medieval women have rights? Yes, they had the right to consent to marriage, the right to a dower, and the right to own property if they were single or widowed. But these rights were limited and conditional. More important than the rights written on paper was a woman's ability to navigate her world. She used the law when she could, found power in her work, her community, her faith, and her family. Her life was a constant negotiation. The picture we have in our heads of a completely powerless woman is too simple. The real story is the story of that negotiation, the story of how, in a world that tried to silence them, they found ways to speak.